Hey, good morning, everyone. Guys, how many of you went axe throwing on Friday? Anybody here went axe throwing? Yeah? Ladies, I got to tell you, if the world's coming to an end and we have to go back like hunting for our own food with axes and bows, we're all going to be in trouble, okay? We hit everything except what we wanted to hit. So that was a lot of fun. Thank you guys for coming out and having a blast with us that night, throwing axes. Nobody got hurt, which is amazing because several times axes were thrown while people were down there picking up their axe. And we're like, hey, my bad. Hey, that's on me. I owe you one. I'm sorry about that. Which I'm not sure is, really, really equivalent to almost killing somebody, but we apologize every time we did that. You may not know this about me, but I love movies. Of course, the TBS version. But I love movies. I love to watch movies. I just love to sit down and relax and unwind watching a movie. A lot of times I'll fall asleep in a movie. Anybody else? You turn a movie on, a few seconds later, you're out cold. Yeah. Sometimes I fall asleep in a movie, and I think that's because, the movie's not any good. Like the storyline doesn't catch me at the beginning of the movie. But I love to try and watch a movie. And in general, I think, as I've thought about this, my favorite movies. You probably think this is true too. Your favorite movies. The reason they are your favorite movies is because of the story they tell. Right? Like something about that story captivates you. Something about that story draws you in because we're people who like stories. Right? We sit around fire pits and tell stories. We go to coffee shops and tell stories. If you have kids and your kids are anything like mine, after school they come home and they have stories about their day. We are people who like stories. But this is also true about me, and it's probably true about you. I don't typically think of my life in this way. You probably don't think of your life in this way, and that is that your life is telling a story. I don't often think, hey, my life is telling a story to someone else, but you are telling a story to the people around us, and we make up this story one decision at a time. And so it's so important for us to know that the decisions you make determine the story you'll tell. Right? The decisions you make today will be at some point a part of your story. The decisions you've made in the past are a part of your story. You decided to date them. That's part of your story. You decided to switch jobs. That's part of your story. You decided to say that or to not say that. It's part of your story. You decided to move there or to stay here. You made that part of your story. You decided to join that group or not be a part of that group. And that is part of your story. Your decisions determine the story you will tell. And the truth is, there's no do-over, is there? There's no do-over. There's no reset. I grew up playing video games. Any of you like to play video games? Any video game players? A few of you in here? A few of you are like losers. Get outside, right? But video games are fun. I still like to play them. But when I was growing up, the game system that we had was not like the fancy game systems today. Like my kids will play a game, and in the middle of a level, they'll just stop, set the system down, and go do something else. And I'm thinking, like, all that work is wasted. But the reality is, they can just save it. It just saves right where you're at in the middle of the game, right? And in fact, if you've moved on and you're like, you know what? I didn't do that last part as good. You can just go back into the game and do it. Now, when I was a kid, there was no such luxury, right? Because I had a Nintendo. You remember the old school Nintendo? I had a Nintendo. And when you played a Nintendo, like, it was a commitment of time because there was no save option. It was, hey, mom and dad, I'm going to see you next week. I'm going to go try to beat this game. Throw some snacks in every now and then. You had to play from beginning to end. And you couldn't just die as many times as you wanted. You actually had to be good at the game. I watch my kids play today, and I'm like, you've died 97 times. How can you still be right here? You get 3 lives in the old Nintendo. If you know a cheat code, they may give you 6. That's it. And you got to get through it. And I remember as a kid, and I would be playing this game, competing with my friends on a Nintendo. Maybe you'll relate to this. If it wasn't going the way I wanted, if it wasn't going to end the way I wanted, if they were about to beat me, there was a button on the front of the Nintendo. Does anybody remember what that button said? Reset. Yeah, brother, come on. Reset. I can't tell you how many fights have been started in the world by the person losing hitting the reset button, right? Like, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to hit that. And you have to start back over at the beginning. Well, unfortunately, in life, we can't just lean up and hit a reset button. We can't look at our story and say, hey, I want to do that over. Every decision we have made is now a part of our story. Now, you may be in the middle of a situation. There may be something currently going on right now, and it doesn't feel that way. But in a little bit of time, once that is behind you, that will be a part of your story. Now, whether or not you want your story told, it totally hinges on the decisions you make. Because we tell our story one decision at a time. And in this series called A Question Worth Asking, we are presenting to you 4 questions that we truly will believe will help you make better decisions. We believe these decisions will help you live a life that honors the life God has called you to. Now, if you're here today and you're not a follower of Jesus, you're just here hanging out with somebody or somebody promised you lunch, I still believe these questions will help you make better decisions. But if you are a follower of Jesus, so much more rides on us making the right decisions. So much more is on the questions we ask and their importance. And so last week, we looked at Proverbs 27:12. We're going to start there again today. I'm going to read this to you. It says, a sensible person sees danger and takes cover. And the inexperienced or the simple, some translations say the foolish, keep going and are punished. So the sensible, the wise, they look down the road to what their decision would cause, what would happen, and they make a wise decision. But the fool, the simple, makes a decision based off of that moment. They just look down right here, right where they're at, and they make that decision. Now, the questions we're going to ask over these 4 weeks, the one we asked last week, this week, and the weeks to come, they're pretty simple questions. They aren't hard to understand, but the reality is they're pretty difficult for us to practice. We have a hard time putting these into practice, and I don't know why that is. I'm not sure if that's because we're not used to slowing down before we make decisions. We just kind of live in a world that is rush, make a decision and go, and we don't take the time to slow down. I don't know if we're just not in the practice of doing it. We haven't trained and disciplined ourselves to do it. But whatever the case may be for you, they're pretty easy questions to understand, but they are hard to put into practice. And so last week, we asked the question, am I really being honest with myself? Before we make a decision, we should always ask this question, am I really being honest with myself? And this week, we're going to ask a question that makes us do something we don't often do. The question this week is going to make us take a step back. It's going to make us zoom out of the situation. It's going to make us look at the situation from a 30,000-foot view. It's going to pull us out of the immediate and help us look at the bigger picture. And here is the question we're asking this week. What story do I want to tell? What story do I want to tell? What story do you want to tell? When it comes to the job that you have, what story do you want to tell at the end of that job? When it comes to the relationship you're in or the relationship you're hoping to be in, what story do you want to tell? When it comes to the opportunity that's in front of you right now, whatever that may be, it's probably different for all of us. When it comes to that opportunity, what story do you want to tell? When it comes to raising your children, when they're grown and gone, what story do you want to have told about your life? Whatever season of life you're in, what story do you want to be told? Because the truth is, we have a few options here, right? We have a few options when it comes to the stories we tell. We can choose to tell a story, live a life, make decisions where we're the hero or where we are the villain. You can make decisions. You can choose to tell a story that you would be proud for other people to tell, or you would hope no one ever tells. You can make decisions that lead you to a life where you tell a story that you are glad your kids know, or a story that you hope your kids never ask about. And while the thought of somebody telling our story, us telling our story, might seem terrifying, right? That can be scary when you think of it this way. It can be scary when you think of it at the end of your life. Somebody's going to tell this story. The good news is you are in control. The good news is this, is you get to decide what story will be told one decision at a time. I'm not telling your story for you. I'm not forcing you to tell a story. Somebody else isn't forcing you to tell a story. You get to decide one decision at a time. You get to decide, hey, my marriage is rocky, so I'm just going to give up on it. That's a bad story. Or you get to decide, hey, my marriage is rocky and I'm going to stay and work. That's a good story. You get to decide, hey, if I lie at work, I know I'm going to get the promotion, but that's a bad story. Or you can decide, hey, I'm going to tell the truth and I'm not sure what's going to happen, but that's a good story. You get to decide. You get to decide, hey, God's call for my life is a little bit uncomfortable and a little bit terrifying right now, so I'm going to run from it. But that's a bad story. Or you can say, hey, in spite of my fears and uncertainty, I'm going to trust God. That is a good story. And this is great news. You get to make those decisions. You get to decide. Every decision becomes a part of your story. Now, here's the thing about this. We usually don't live with the story in mind. I said that earlier. We usually don't live thinking about the entirety of our story being told. We usually live thinking about our current situation, where we're at right now, which means this: we often make our decisions based off emotion and pressure. Right? We often make decisions make our decisions based off emotion and pressure. When you think back, you would probably say, yeah, that's true. I have made a lot of my decisions that way. The last decision you made from emotion or pressure, maybe you were mad at your boss, and so you made a decision because of that emotion. Maybe you just loved that thing, and so you had to buy it. You made a decision off of that emotion in the moment. Maybe you were mad at her, you were mad at him, and you got in an argument, and you said some things. You made the decision based off of your emotion in that moment. Maybe if you didn't do this certain thing, somebody else was going to get that job, and so you felt that pressure. You had a deadline to meet, and so you cut some corners. You made a decision based off the pressure, whether it's pressure or emotion, whether it's love or fear or jealousy or pride. We usually don't think next week. We almost never think next year, and we certainly don't think the story of our lives. We think right now, the situation I'm in right now. Right now, I need the promotion over being a person of integrity. Right now, I need more money instead of, will my kids know me when they leave the house? Right now, we think this relationship is hard instead of, man, I want this relationship to last. We think about the current. We talked about this last week, we decide what we want now instead of what we want most. We make a decision on what we want now instead of stopping to think about what we want most. And the truth is, this emotion, this pressure, when we make decisions that way, it clouds our judgment. It clouds our judgment. You know this is true. You can look back on decisions you make, and now that you're removed from them and that cloud is gone, you look back and say, I was so stupid. Why did I do that? Why did I buy that? Why did I say that? Why did I go there with them, right? Because there was emotion attached then, and your judgment was clouded. And now when you look back, that emotion, that pressure is gone, and you look back and go, I was an idiot, right? You've all said that in your life. Emotion and pressure clouds decision, because when we're in the middle of this emotion, when we're in the middle of this pressure, we think about now, and we worry about later. When? Later. Right? I got to worry about now. I'll worry about later. And we don't make wise decisions. And guess what? There's good news. We're not alone. We're not the first generation to do this. And today we're going to look at a story. We're going to be in the book of Genesis. We'll start out in Genesis chapter 39. But there's a man by the name of Joseph. And he dealt with this same thing. He had to make decisions based on either now or the story he wanted to tell. And this is kind of a big story. We're going to look at most of it because it really shows the entirety of his life and how this was a continual issue in his life. And this story took place around 1800 BC. And you may be familiar with this story. You may not. That's okay. Joseph was number 11 of 12 sons. So I have 4. I don't know how that's possible. I know how it's possible. I'm unwilling. 11 of 12 sons. And it says when you read the story that he was his father's favorite because he was the oldest of his father's favorite wife. This is a side note, guys. You don't need a favorite wife, okay? Just the one, okay? So that's why his dad loved him the most. He was the oldest of his father's favorite wife, and his brothers were jealous. And so they decided, hey, we're going to kill him. We're sick of him being the favorite. We're going to kill him. And so they're off one day by themselves, just the brothers, and they decide to kill him. But when the time comes, they don't have the nerve to do it. And so they see this caravan coming through, and it's slave traders. And so they say, instead of killing him, we're going to sell him to these slave traders. And so that's exactly what they do. They sell him to slave traders. They take his coat. They put some animal's blood on it. They take it back to their dad and say, Dad, your favorite has been killed by a wild animal. That's the decision they made. This is an example of a bad story to tell. They made a decision that requires them for the rest of their life to lie about their story. Never make a decision that's going to require you to lie about your story to someone else. And so they sell him to slave traders, and those slave traders sell him to Egypt. And in Egypt, he gets put in Potiphar's house. Now, Potiphar is a military commander. He's in charge. He's a high-ranking official. He's in charge of the military. And Joseph had to decide in this moment what story he wanted to tell as a slave. He could run away, which slaves often did. That could have been part of his story. He could have just been a lazy slave, which is what approach most slaves took. Like, they weren't working hard. They were slaves. They just kind of took it easy and were lazy. That was the most common. He could have done that. That was part of the position he found himself in. But he had to decide. Do I do one of those two things, or do I go all out and be the best at whatever they give me to do that I possibly can? And remember, this is a rich kid. Joseph's a rich kid. He's from a well-off family. He just went from being his dad's favorite in a rich family to this situation that he had nothing to do with. He did not get himself into this situation. And that part of his story is sometimes like our story, isn't it? Sometimes in our story, we say, hey, my story's kind of been taken over by someone else. You find yourself in a situation that really wasn't your fault. You didn't make a bad choice. You didn't make a bad decision, but the circumstances brought it to you. That's Joseph's story. He could have said, who cares, and given up. He could have said, I'm not going to work hard at this. Or he could have said, I know the story I want to be told. And so he decides to do the best, even though the circumstances he found himself in were not by his own creation. Like, he just had some really bad luck and some really jerky brothers. You thought your brother was mean? His were the worst. And he finds himself in this situation, and he says, no, this is the story I want to tell. And he decides to do his best. And before long, when you read the story, he does so good that Potiphar puts him in charge of everything in his house. Like, he gets a promotion to everything. It's truly a riches to rags to riches story. It's a good story. It's a good story, but also, like our life, it is not the end. There's more decisions he has to make. And Joseph soon found himself ready to make another decision. In Genesis 39, verse 6, it says this: Now Joseph was well-built and handsome. If a book's ever written about me and you write it, let's start with this line, okay? I just told you not to lie, but maybe you can put a little asterisk by it. That's what it says. He was well-built and handsome. Also, this is not a throwaway line. You kind of know, hey, this is going to lead into something. And sure enough, it does. In verse 7, it says this: After some time, his master's wife looked longingly at Joseph and said, sleep with me. Hello, decision time, right? Like, Joseph's 19, 20 years old. I'm assuming when you're one of the most powerful people in the nation, your wife's probably pretty good looking. And she's like, hey, Joe, let's do this. And he's 20, and he's got to make a decision. And young Joseph talks to this wife of Potiphar, and he tells her the story that he wants told about him and the story she should want told about her. Look what he says in verse 8 to her. But he refused. But he refused. Look, he said to his master's wife, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in his house. And he's put all that he owns under my authority, and no one in this house is greater than I am. He's telling her his story. He's withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. So how could I do this immense evil, and how could I sin against God? Joseph is laying out his story. He's laying out the story that he wants told. He says, listen, I do not want the story to be that a rich kid is sold into slavery, works his way to the top of Potiphar's house, and once he gets there, he sleeps with his wife and loses it all. Joseph says, that's not the story I want told. And this seems like an easy decision, right? This seems like a right or wrong decision. But the reality is that this was a very difficult decision, because we need to understand that telling Potiphar's wife no was only slightly less dangerous than telling Potiphar no. Like, people didn't tell her no often. She was very powerful. What she wanted, she got. And so Joseph knew that no was not a word Miss Potiphar was used to hearing. She was not used to receiving that message from people, let alone slaves in her house. And Joseph knew that by telling her no, this could very well cost him his life. This could very well cost him his life. Everything that he had worked to could be over because he tells her no. And so the easy thing to do would have been to give in and just sleep with her. More than likely, Potiphar's wife had a lot of men on the side in her relationships. So he could have just said, hey, I'm going to be one of them and hope Potiphar doesn't find out. That's the easy thing to do. I've got a good gig here. I'll keep what I've got going on and hopefully he doesn't find out. But that wasn't the story that Joseph wanted to tell. And he continually tells her no over and over again until one day she's tired of it. And in her anger, she goes to her husband and she lies to Potiphar and she says, hey, listen, Joseph tried to force himself on me. And of course, Potiphar is furious. And so Potiphar takes Joseph and throws him into prison. And although it may not seem like it, this moment in Joseph's life should be encouragement to us. It should be encouragement to us because even in dark seasons of our life, even in the valleys of our life, even when we're faced with a decision where it feels like doing what is right is going to be a death sentence. And I promise, if you try to do what's right in life, if you try to live a life that pleases God, there will be moments where the right decision is going to cost you. Where making the right decision is not going to get the outcome you want. And to him, it felt like a death sentence. There will be moments where you know that the right decision will cost you financially and it will cost you in your reputation. It will cost you maybe relation in some other way. And like Joseph, we have to remember that we are telling a story in every decision we make. Every decision, especially, we need to remember this, especially the decisions you make in the valleys of life are still part of your story. Right? It's easy to make the right decision on the mountaintops. In the dark seasons of life, those decisions still matter to the story we are telling. And like Joseph, in the middle of emotion and in the middle of pressure and in the middle of this dark season, we have to make decisions that allow us to tell a good story. And so Joseph, sure enough, made the right decision because of the story he wanted to tell, and it cost him. They throw him in prison, which shows us that right decisions, listen, this is important, right decisions do not always lead to convenient outcomes. There is nowhere in God's word that it says, hey, when you make the right decision, things on earth will be easier. That is proven in this story here by Joseph. He made the right decision, but it gets him put into prison. And this should encourage us. It's such a good story. I encourage you to read it this week, but I'm going to have to summarize some of the rest of it for time's sake. So Joseph finds himself in prison for 8 years, which is a long time. And it says when you read that he becomes the warden's favorite prisoner. Now, I talk to my kids a lot about what they want to be when they grow up. And you know what they've never said? The warden's favorite prisoner. It was a good position. It's good if you find yourself in prison to be the warden's favorite. But you know what's better? Not being in prison, all right? But he finds himself in prison. He's the warden's favorite prisoner. And in prison, there's a couple of guys that had served Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the king of Egypt, so even higher than Potiphar. Pharaoh, there's no one higher. These guys were a cupbearer and a baker. They kind of worked in the kitchen there of the king, and they get tossed into prison. And then they have a dream. And Joseph finds out, and they come to Joseph, and Joseph is able to interpret their dreams, and he tells the cupbearer what his dream meant. He says, hey, your dream means that in 3 days, they're going to come get you out of this prison, and you're going to be restored to your position to Pharaoh. You're going to get your title back, your position back, and of course, the cupbearer is thrilled, and so Joseph says, hey, when that happens, will you remember me? Remember what I've done here in the prison. Remember that I interpreted your dream. Will you remember me? And the cupbearer says, like anybody would who hears this news, yeah, man, of course, I got you. I'll remember you. And he gets out, and guess what he does? He completely forgets him. He forgets him for 2 years. 2 years goes by. The cupbearer doesn't remember Joseph. Joseph is still in prison until one day, Pharaoh, the king, has a dream, and nobody, his wise men, his advisors, could interpret his dream. And so he's looking for somebody. And the cupbearer remembers, probably more in an effort to gain favor, but whatever the reason, he goes to the king and he says, hey, I know a guy. I've been meaning to tell you about him, right? Like, I know a guy. And so Pharaoh sends for Joseph, and Joseph comes out of prison, and he tells Pharaoh what his dream means. And he tells him, he says, listen, this is what your dream means. It means that in Egypt, there's going to be 7 years of just more food than we can have. Like, the harvest is going to be great. But immediately following that, there's going to be 7 years of drought and famine. 7 great years, 7 bad years. And Egypt was a grain society. They lived on bread. They sold their grain to other nations around them. So a drought for them would wreak havoc on their economy and on their people and the regions around them. And so Joseph interprets the dream, and instead of being quiet as soon as he's done interpreting the dream like he should, because let's remember, he has no position here. He is a slave who they literally just pulled out of prison. He probably looked horrible and smelled worse. He does something that is amazing. Pharaoh sends for Joseph, brings him out, he interprets the dream, and then he says this in verse 33 of Genesis 41. So now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. And that just seems like, oh, that's common sense. But what is happening right here is a slave who just got pulled out of prison is giving unsolicited advice to the king of Egypt. And that doesn't happen. The crowd around Pharaoh would have been shocked. Like, you would have heard audible gasps. People would have covered their mouths because they would have been thinking, this boy who's now about 30 is about to get either thrown back in prison. At best case, he may be killed right here on the spot for having the audacity, for having the boldness to just speak to Pharaoh. But in Joseph's story, in all of his story, the good, the bad, the highs, the lows, Joseph knew what story he wanted to tell, and he knew that God was playing a role in the story. And so look at how Pharaoh responded to this unsolicited advice. Pharaoh says this, the proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And he said to them, can we find anyone like this? A man who has God's Spirit in him? So just a second ago, he's a lowly slave in prison. And now the king of Egypt is saying, can we find anyone else like him? So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, look how Joseph's story is showing God to others. There's no one as discerning and as wise as you are. You will be over my house, and all my people will obey your commands. Only I, as king, will be greater than you. And this just shows that Joseph hadn't changed, that he had determined long ago in his life that he was going to tell a good story. His circumstances had changed. They had changed a lot. He had been in his dad's house, then he's sold as a slave, then he's in Potiphar's house, then he becomes in charge, then he gets thrown into prison, and then he works his way up in charge of prison, and now he's in Pharaoh's house. But the story he was telling never changed. The circumstances changed a ton, and what's true about Joseph should be true about us is ultimately who you are, not where you are, determines the story you will tell. Right? Who you are, not where you are, determines the story you will tell. I doubt any of us in this room have had a roller coaster of a life that Joseph had. We've probably had some ups and downs, right? But I mean, his was constant, up, down, up, down. And he stayed true to who he was. And Joseph knew that who he was more important than where he was. Who we are will direct our decisions when we're under pressure, when we are faced with emotion, when we're in a dark season of life. It matters who we are long before who we are is put to the test. It's a decision we have to make about the story we want to tell before the moment comes up. It's a decision we have to make long ago, and Joseph knew that, and that's why he's able to keep telling the same great story. And I just want to show you one more place in Joseph's life that he had to decide what kind of story he's going to tell. And maybe, honestly, I can relate to this part the most. Maybe this is the hardest part of his story to tell a good story. Because sure enough, he's put in charge of Egypt. I mean, only Pharaoh, only the king is over him. That's amazing. And he does a great job in the 7 years of plenty of food. He does a great job of taxing the people and storing up food because he knew the famine was coming. He knew the drought was coming and that they needed to have barns and warehouses full of food. And so he does a great job of leading Egypt. And when the 7 bad years comes, Egypt is the only place in the region that has food. And caravans begin to come to Egypt to buy food. Like Egypt begins to make a lot of money off of this because of Joseph leading so well. But guess who comes on one of these caravans? His brothers. His brothers, remember his brothers, the ones who wanted to kill him but decided to be nice, so we'll just sell him into slavery. Those brothers, they come on a caravan to buy food, and he recognizes them. Look what it says in Genesis 42, verse 8. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. They didn't recognize him, and some stuff happens. And if you jump down to Genesis 45, it says this, Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But they could not answer him because they were terrified in his presence. And I get it. I can understand why they were terrified, right? When he reveals himself to them, they are not happy. They're not like, brother, we've missed you so much. Game night at home hasn't been the same without you. Like, that's not what they said. They are terrified because they are sure that he would do to them what they would have done to him if they were in his shoes. They are sure that he is going to get revenge, that he is going to get payback. Because when we are given some power, we like to let everybody know that we have some power, don't we? I was coaching my son in flag football, and we were dominating the other team. Not to brag, but we were killing them. And it was like 30-something to nothing. And we weren't trying to run up the score. Our kids were just better than theirs. I don't know how to say it, but they just were. And so that was the score. And the other coach was a little upset. I said, man, I'm not doing anything. They're just, running the ball, and your kids missed their flags. I'm sorry. And so they ran a play, the other team, and the coach's son was going down the sidelines, and he threw up the peace sign to the people behind him. You see some pros do that. Well, the competitive nature in me thought, well, this is not going to end well for your team, all right? I was going to try to hold the reins in. I was going to try to hold it back, but this is not going to be good, right? And I had the kids on my team who were not the best kids in at the time. I was trying to slow it down. And so he's cheering his son on, who's running down the field, throwing a peace sign to my kids. And so I did a mass substitution. Hey, all of y'all get out. Sorry, your time's over. Send in the good kids, right? I didn't say it that way. But they came in, and so as they were going for their 2-point conversion, they threw a pass, and we intercepted it and ran for a touchdown. And inside of me, I got to tell you, I didn't say anything. I didn't even smile. But inside, I was like, yeah, see how that worked out for you, buddy, right? Listen, I'm not perfect. God's still working on me, okay? I'm not saying this is right. Pray for me. I'm just telling you, the reality is when we have a little bit of power, when we have a little bit of authority, we like others to know. And if we have the opportunity for a little bit of payback, if we have the opportunity for a little bit of revenge, we're usually okay with that being part of our story, aren't we? Maybe even proud that it's part of our story. And really, in this moment, this is a culmination for Joseph. He could have gotten revenge on the ones that led to his imprisonment, the ones that led to him being a slave. And not only could he have gotten revenge, he would have been justified in doing so. Nobody would have questioned that. Nobody would have said, Joseph, you shouldn't have. Everybody would have said, yeah, man, I get it. I'd have done the same thing if I was in charge. He could have done that, but Joseph didn't make a decision on emotion. He didn't make a decision in the pressure of that moment. He made a decision based on the story that he wanted to tell. He had committed his entire life to telling a good story, and he wasn't going to throw it away now for revenge. And ultimately, because of the story Joseph was committed to telling, he saves Egypt and the regions around it. And his brothers and father end up moving there to Egypt, and he protects them and provides for them. And this is so much better of a story, of a chapter in his story to tell than, the brothers came back into my life and I had them all killed, right? In the moment, that probably felt good, but at the end, it's not a good story. He made the right decision, all because he appears to ask the question, what story do I want to tell? Now, before we think of this as just some old story in the Old Testament that, hey, Mike, let's get it's Joseph, nobody's selling me into another nation right now. What do I really have to learn from this? Before we think that, I want to remind you of a man named Jesus who in Matthew 5 has a crowd around him. And he tells it very much in a shorter version, the same thing. He says this in Matthew chapter 5, in the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. In other words, Jesus says to those people that day and says to us, tell a good story. Make decisions so that you tell a good story that makes other people look to me because of the story you're telling, which leads back to you and me to the question, what story do you want to tell? What story do you want to tell? Let me ask it this way. When you're gone, I've done a lot of funerals in this line of work. It's one of the things you have to do. And when you are at those funerals, somebody, maybe a few people, will get up, and your life at that moment is nothing more than a collection of stories. What story do you want to be told about you? What story do you want to be told about you? Do you want your story to be like the story of Joseph's brother and Potiphar's wife? A story that you have to lie about, that you're ashamed of, that you hope people don't tell about you? Or like Joseph, do you want your story to be one that you are happy to share? That you're glad for others to know? It really is up to you, because professionally and relationally and financially, in every area of your life, you get to make the decisions. And your story is a collection of your decisions. One decision at a time, you are telling your story. And so what if you decided today, and maybe, listen, maybe you've made some bad decisions. Maybe there's some chapters in your story. We probably all have chapters in our story that we would rather not be known. The good news is Jesus forgives us in those moments. He has forgiven us for those chapters. And we can decide today, from this point forward, I'm going to tell a story that I will be proud to tell. And I'm going to do it one decision at a time. Let me leave you with a few questions to think about this week. Here's the first question. How do you tend to speed up or slow down when emotion or pressure is applied to a decision? Most of us speed up. When there's an emotion involved, when there's pressure applied, we say something, we do something, we buy something, we respond a certain way. How do you respond in those moments? Here's the next question for you to think about. Why do you focus on what you want now instead of what you want most? If we could just get this to where we would ask, is this what I want now or is this what I want most? It would change the way we make decisions by asking this. Or here's the final question I would encourage you to ask. What decision do you need to make today that will tell the story you want to tell? Because here's what I know is true about all of you, is you're in the middle of something in your life. Something good, something bad, something that makes sense, something that doesn't make sense. Everybody is in a season, in a place in our lives, and you have a decision that you can make today that will help determine the story that you want to tell. And I just want to encourage you to tell a good story. At some point, your life will be nothing more than a collection of stories, a collection of decisions you have made that tell your story. And like Joseph, and like Jesus tells us to, be a story that's worth telling and that points others to our Heavenly Father. Let's pray together. God, we love you, and we thank you for the story of sending your son Jesus to die for our sins. For the parts of our story that we are ashamed or embarrassed of, God, please remind us that your son's death on the cross and resurrection has provided a way for us to be forgiven. And when you look at us, you do not see those chapters. You see us as righteous and clean because of Jesus. And I pray that if anyone here today has never trusted in Jesus to be their Savior, that today they would say, I'm not writing a good story. I need help in this story. And that they would understand that Jesus died for them so that there could be forgiveness for their sins and a restored relationship with you. And I pray today they would make that decision. And God, for those of us in this room who have trusted in Jesus to be our Savior, God, I pray that we would not, in the moment of pressure and emotion, rush to decisions. I pray that we would think about what we want most. God, I pray that we would think about our lives as we make decisions in its entirety. What story do we want to tell? How can we make a decision that is added to the story that points people to you. God, I pray that we would be a church that tells a story that points people to Jesus. God, we love you and we thank you. There is no one else to serve but you. In your name we pray. Amen.